Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Bob.
How are you doing?
Doing well, thanks. How about you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You are Jessica Chen Weiss, the Michael J. Zach, I believe, professor of China and Asia Pacific Studies at Cornell.
That's right.
You pretty recently finished a stint on the policy planning staff at the Department of State, where I think they do long range, like visionary thinking, right?
Right. I was a Council on Foreign Relations fellow while on sabbatical from Cornell and spent my stint there.
Okay. And speaking of the Council on Foreign Relations, they published the august journal, Foreign Affairs, where you recently had an article that justly was widely discussed called, well, let me first, I want to mention your book because it's relevant.
Great.
Powerful Patriots, Nationalist Protest in China's Foreign Relations, published by Oxford University Press. But the journal piece was called The China Trap, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Perilous Logic of Zero-Sum Competition. We're going to talk about that and about, broadly speaking, the China question, to what extent and in what ways does it threaten American interests and other interests in the world, and what should and shouldn't be done about it. I wanted to start off with a question that if you want to dodge, you can, or if you want to hold it off until the end of the conversation after you think about it a while, you can, because I didn't warn you about it. But it's about the perception gap. I was going to ask really two questions. If there's one thing you think Americans don't understand about how China views the world, one consequential thing, and here Americans could mean, grassroots Americans or foreign policy elites. And when I say how China views the world, it could be the grassroots view, the leadership's view. I was going to ask, what would that one consequential misunderstanding be? And then I was going to also reverse the question and say, if you think there's something that isn't well understood in China about perspectives from America, if any of that makes sense. Now I give you the option of taking the fifth, just for dodging it entirely, asking if we could put it off till the end of the conversation, or going ahead and diving into that.
I'll take a stab. I think that there's, we talk about China and Beijing a lot, but there's actually a lot of, I think, uncertainty even inside China about where China is going. And so I think that one of the big things that Americans maybe don't appreciate enough about China is really the range of potential directions and trajectories that China itself could follow. I'm not just talking about China's economic growth and whether it will stagnate or collapse. I'm also talking about what does China want in the world? And I think that that's really a moving target. It's not something that I wrote about in the piece, but it's very much a part of my ongoing work in thinking about what it is that China is, how domestic politics in China affect what it seeks in the world, and to what extent that poses a challenge to the existing international order.
Okay. And so you think even within the leadership, there's a certain amount of uncertainty or flexibility?
I don't know if flexibility is exactly the right word. I would say that there's a very much of a presentism. There is a what are the challenges that need to be dealt with today? I mean, that's very much true also in the United States, where, the long range planning, even though it's something that we aspire to, and certainly the Chinese government aspires to and does a great deal of effort to plan, if every 5 years, what's the plan? Nonetheless, there's a lot of kind of wiggle room left in there, these are broad aspirations, but exactly what are the practical steps that are needed to get to that destination? I think there's a lot more the phrases, cross the river by feeling for stones. There's still a fair amount of, what works? Mm-hmm. And sort of what is, take one step, figure out what's the reaction to that, then take another step and, adjust along the way. So there's constantly this sort of hedging. And what that means is that there's a lot of internal kind of what the Chinese would call contradictions, but there's a lot of internal cross currents that make it very difficult, I think, for us to say with any certainty, this is where China's going, or, we don't even know, I think, China's intentions long run. I think we should be a lot more agnostic than we sometimes.
So there's more improvising going on, it sounds like, in Beijing.
I think that's right. That's right.
Okay, well, I'll try to follow that theme through the conversation and get back to that. And is there anything you'd say about the reverse version of the question, things about America that are misunderstood in China?
I would say that, there's a really strong streak of suspicion that I think is, to some extent warranted, but by no means universally shared amongst Americans that, I don't think it is necessarily every American's purpose to keep China down or to weaken the Chinese Communist Party. But that streak of concern, some might even say paranoia, I think has grown larger. And certainly there are things that the United States has done to feed that and to affirm that suspicion. But, the United States is also, a country in ferment. And I think that there are a lot of potential possibilities that really resist this kind of fatalism on both sides. It doesn't need to be a new Cold War when we can, I think collectively, if we were to take incremental steps back from the brink, could imagine a different future.
And there's a larger historical narrative, I gather, in China about the West holding it down going way back, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. The one question about the near future in Chinese politics. So we're recording this in very late September. It won't run right away, but I know at some point in October, Xi Jinping comes up for. They'll decide whether he gets a third term. People in America are talking about as if it's a sure thing, and some are talking as if once he's got the third term, he's kind of emperor for life or something. That's it. I don't know. Is there any how much indeterminacy, if any, is there in this? Is this like a done deal?
I think all signs point to that. It's certainly that he's going to get a third term. There's a long distance between a third term and emperor for life, and so I don't know that we will necessarily see Xi Jinping come out from this emboldened, strengthened. He could be, some have speculated, could be a little bit more constrained, get a third term, but not necessarily emerge from this so much stronger. So I think there's a lot of indeterminacy, but that indeterminacy is within a kind of a narrower band, well short of, some fanciful illusions of, collapse or, dictatorship, totalitarian dictatorship.
And historically, 2 terms has been the max. Has that been a norm, just a norm, or like a law that he somehow changed or something?
Well, there was an effort, a successful effort to revise the Constitution to remove that norm or law against an additional term. And so that was a norm that was institutionalized under his predecessors. Of course, it took time for that to come into place. Certainly, Mao Zedong didn't rule in that way. And so this is something that, emerged over the last couple of decades. But it's been dispensed with, really. And that's in part why people have, I think, seen that even though there is a lot of a kind of a groundswell of unhappiness with some of the policies that Xi Jinping has adopted, all the institutional markers are of continued strength under his leadership.
What is the discontent about? There has been growing grassroots discontent over the last few years.
I would say it's not just grassroots. I mean, there's elite discontent as well. I mean, nobody cracks down on as many officials as he has without generating some discontent. But it's not just that; it's also the concern about the draconian crackdowns on COVID, the sort of zero COVID or dynamic zero policies that he's put in place and really kept in place, rather than relying on mRNA vaccines or such that could provide a way out of this kind of policy. Now, there may be some reasons for keeping that in place that have to do with avoiding the kinds of deaths that we've experienced here in the United States and elsewhere. But that's coming at a significant cost to economic growth and the budgets of local officials. So, there's a ways in which kind of this stability above all else approach that Xi Jinping has taken has some real downsides that I think are generating a lot of discontent.
But for now, it looks like he's going to weather it. So let's talk about your piece in Foreign Affairs. I'm sure the name Xi Jinping will come up again in the conversation. I'm going to read from the first paragraph of the piece. First sentence is: competition with China has begun to consume U.S. foreign policy. Then near the bottom of this first paragraph it says, the current course will not just bring indefinite deterioration of the U.S.-Chinese relationship and a growing danger of catastrophic conflict. It also threatens to undermine the sustainability of American leadership in the world and the vitality of American society and democracy at home. That sounds like a lot of downside. Is it possible to characterize, broadly speaking, what is wrong with our paradigm, or would you rather just take these issues like one by one?
The short answer, or the broad paradigm, is that I think we're mostly focused on beating China and not on what it is that we want, irrespective of that goal. And of course, pushing back and countering China may be a portion of achieving what it is that we want, this affirmative vision for how the United States relates to the world. But I think that emphasis is secondary. The stronger muscle here is really on the effort to outcompete and counter without a fixed sense of where it is we are going and how do we manage those risks of confrontation.
And what do you think kind of the sense of threat is in America? In other words, what is the most widespread fear about what will happen if we in some sense lose to China? I mean, well, first of all, in what sense? There's economic competition. There's competition for global influence. These are different and related things. There's competition for military supremacy as opposed to softer forms of influence exertion in the world. I gather you're talking about us striving to stay ahead on like all of these fronts, with the idea being that some peril looms if we fail to go 3 for 3 there or something.
I think that's right. I think that there's no sense of what would be enough. I think that there's a sense that as long as we are ahead of China in each and every domain, on each and every metric, then we'll be okay. But I think that overarching impetus makes it hard to prioritize. First of all, where do we need to stay ahead? Or even if we want to stay ahead, like where are we going and how do we avoid triggering the exact same kinds of instincts on the Chinese side, which is, well, then the real risk is that, of course, Beijing also concludes that the only way for Beijing to feel secure is to beat the United States. And given the evolving, I think, terrain of power and influence, that we may not necessarily come out ahead. And certainly the costs, I think, may be immense, particularly in terms of our comparative advantages, in terms of retaining an open and attractive society, which is very much not China's strength.
Okay. Let's talk about the first danger you list, the growing danger of catastrophic conflict. There has been obviously a certain amount of tension in that region. Tension between China and some of its neighbors over territorial disputes. The issue of Taiwan has loomed very large lately. What catastrophic conflict scenarios are you most worried about, and how do you think we're in danger of making them more likely?
My biggest concern is Taiwan. This is an issue that is, really rapidly, I think, on an escalator toward crisis and potential conflict. Not just because of things that we are doing. Of course, there are long-run demographic and political trends on Taiwan that are moving the island further and further away from a Chinese identity. And you also have Beijing's heavy-handed crackdown in Hong Kong, making the prospects of unification under something like a one country, two systems a model more and more repugnant to democratic voters on Taiwan. Those are sort of the structural trends in recent developments. And in response, Beijing has stepped up its pressure campaign to deter what it sees as steady by steady kind of salami slicing by the United States and Taiwan, which the United States, I would say, for its part, really sees as an effort to bolster deterrence in response to China's increasingly coercive pressure campaign against the island.
So you're saying this salami slicing thing is something we see as deterrence?
I think that's right.
And what exactly do you mean by the salami slicing? What kinds of things?
What I mean is efforts that we take to bolster Taiwan's defense, as well as its morale and its public international profile and support, while still maintaining officially an unchanged stance, which is a one China policy framework and non-support for Taiwan independence. Those are the sort of parameters. But even within those parameters, there's been, I would say, especially under the Trump administration, but continuing a bit, although at a less accelerated pace today, efforts to do more with Taiwan. And those are seen in Beijing as sort of U.S. efforts to support what they see as a kind of steady separation between the island and the mainland, which could be headed in the direction of ultimately independence.
So that includes weapons transfers, I assume, from the U.S. to Taiwan. And what other things are being taken as provocative by China?
It's not quite so much as the weapons transfers, although those certainly are something that has always aggravated Beijing. It's more, I think, the public expressions of symbolic support that seem to signal an incremental upgrade in the kind of what were once unofficial relations between the United States and Taiwan, and between Taiwan and other countries around the world. So it's the renaming of Taiwan's representative office from the Taipei office to Taiwan. It is changing the nature of the contact guidance, first removing restrictions or guidance for how the United States interacted with representatives from Taiwan, and then under the Biden administration, reinstating those, but with a more expanded set of possibilities. And ultimately, you do have, politicians not in the government right now, but suggesting that we should offer right now diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, which would be effectively recognizing them as an independent state. So that's not helpful.
So we should maybe, just for people who aren't that conversant in the history, when Nixon established relations with China, the deal we did was to, as you said, the one China policy. We acknowledge, we do not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. We still don't. We acknowledge that, yes, Taiwan and mainland China are one, as back in history they were, I guess, before Civil War. Attendant on that, there's been a certain amount of strategic ambiguity when people ask, well, would you come to Taiwan's aid if China invaded? Because part of our one China policy is the eventual integration of Taiwan and the rest and mainland China is fine so long as it's done peacefully. And then people say, well, what if it's not done peacefully? There's invasion. Traditionally, we've been ambiguous about that. Well, we don't rule out helping Taiwan. We're not guaranteeing it. Biden seems to have changed that. Now, he said 4 times now, we would come to China's aid, which would be a change. Every time he says it, the White House kind of walks it back. But I assume this looms large in China's perception of what they consider U.S. provocation. What's your take on that? I mean, more and more people are saying, look, let's face it, Biden has changed the policy. And the White House, is increasingly not credible in claiming otherwise.
So I think it's too early to say that Biden has effectively changed the policy. The policy. So first of all, there's 2 important components of the policy. One is the one China framework, and the other is strategic ambiguity, which rests upon deterring unilateral changes by either side to the status quo. And so Biden's comments really are about the latter, which is, what are the conditions under which we would come to Taiwan's aid in terms of sending troops. And what he basically said, and I think there was a little bit of a garble, he said that, in the event of an unprecedented attack, but what would be consistent with policies that he said, in the event of an unprovoked attack, the United States would fight. And if it's unprovoked, then that means it was a unilateral change that Beijing launched.
So you think he misspoke? He had the word unprovoked in mind and said unprecedented?
I think so. And that still leaves space for the second half of strategic ambiguity, which is that we also oppose unilateral changes by the Taiwan side, which, if you'll note, came out and was cleaned up afterwards, and also was, I think, there was a statement at the United Nations too. I think it was Biden's statement at the UN General Assembly, which clarified that or affirmed that the United States opposes unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. So that's really important. I also wanted to go back to the one China policy, which is, I think it's important to note, is that we haven't recognized China's claim to Taiwan. What we have done in the 1970s is acknowledged the Chinese position that that all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is one China and Taiwan is a part of China. So we don't actually say that that's our position. We say that we acknowledge the Chinese position. Okay. And at the time, both sides of the strait actually believed, both of them, in one China. What's changed really with Taiwan's democratization is that people on Taiwan no longer believe in one China. And under the current administration, that one China is pretty anathema. Okay.
And is it your sense increasingly that that Xi Jinping is so determined to not let the prospect of unification slip away that, invasion, I mean, if the status quo, as you said, there is not enthusiasm on Taiwan for integration, less than there used to be. Assuming that remains the same, do you think he would go ahead and invade within a matter of years in any event? Or is it the case that kind of by making a big deal of it, to the extent that we highlight the issue with the various things he considers provocative, we're actually making more likely something that might not be inevitable otherwise?
I think you said it exactly right, which is that I don't think that Xi Jinping wants to invade Taiwan or is looking for an excuse. This is an incredibly difficult and will be, catastrophically costly option. But I think that, if pushed comes to shove and he felt like Taiwan were imminently to become independent or declare independence, that he would fight even a war that he thought the People's Liberation Army might lose. And so I think many other experts don't believe, and I refer you to a recent CSIS poll, don't believe that Xi Jinping has set a hard deadline for an invasion. So it's not at all a foregone conclusion that this is going to happen. But there is a risk that actions that we take in the name of bolstering deterrence and in the name of supporting Taiwan actually feed Beijing's sense of urgency to do something before it's too late. And that's what I worry about.
And what are the things that you think are most kind of ill-advisedly provocative in that domain that the U.S. has done?
Well, first of all, I think that we're looking at a 2024 election cycle here in the United States, and as I said, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is already giving speeches calling for, and on Twitter calling for the United States to recognize Taiwan. That would be flagrantly overturning the one China policy in ways that I think would set us on a course for war in the near term. Short of that, I think there are other things that are more likely to prompt the kinds of military maneuvers that we saw, following Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which, were not aimed at invasion. They weren't even a blockade, but they were military signaling to put the squeeze on Taiwan to demonstrate that China could, using the tools that it has, incrementally erode the status quo to Beijing's advantage in ways that, make it more threatening and more difficult for Taiwan to thrive as it has for the last several decades. And so there's a whole range of different things, I think. And of course, there are things that we also need to do to bolster deterrence in terms of doing things quietly to help Taiwan bolster its defenses, to get its military in some kind of fighting shape to be able to hold out, to put up kind of the civil resistance. There's a whole lot of things that Taiwan hasn't yet to date done. I think after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the message has, I think, gotten louder and I think is understood. But still, I think they're months, years away from being in a position to do what I think needs to be done. And I think there are people in the U.S. military that say if Taiwan, we can't we can't fight, if Taiwan's not there as well. Right? So if Taiwan doesn't fight, we're not going to be able to save Taiwan either.
So you think it does make sense to send the kinds of weapons that well, the classic metaphor is a porcupine, right? Turn Taiwan into a porcupine that's hard for China to digest. And you think a certain amount of that makes sense?
I do think that a certain amount of that makes sense. And I think that one of the disadvantages of what Biden is saying, even though I don't think it necessarily changes policy, is that it undermines Taiwan's incentive to do what it needs to do. If it feels like the United States has the illusion that the United States is going to solve the problem, then that gives them less incentive to do what they need to do too.
And you worry about the flip side of this, where Putin kind of said that more or less explicitly that the flip side was had something to do with the invasion. And by flip side, I mean, if you're sending arms that make the country harder to invade, why not act now? If you're planning, if you think you may need to do it eventually, you think that risk is not so great as to outweigh the advantage, the deterrent advantage.
I mean, I think what you really risk is, a spiraling arms race. And you have to be careful about creating what seem to be like big windows of opportunity where right now Taiwan is defenseless, but in like 3 years they will be defended. I think that's dangerous. But if you're doing it in a kind of incremental way that keeps pace with, or maybe gets a little ahead of, but, is, calibrated appropriately, then you can kind of mitigate some of those risks.
Okay. Now, if you ask why has the U.S. been, what China calls provocative, but leave aside that characterization, somewhat more forceful in its support of Taiwan and in its criticism of China and so on, you get various answers. Some people mention the Taiwan lobby. Okay, but there's always been a Taiwan lobby. And I think, so the question has to become why has the ground been more fertile for advocates of these kinds of policies lately? I think there's no doubt that from China's side, there's been a sense of greater militancy that doesn't coincide exactly with the tenure of Xi Jinping, I guess, but has grown over the last decade or a bit more, maybe. And there is a sense of threat from China that, is in the background of our Taiwan policy, right? There's a sense of threat, not just to Taiwan, but the sense that China is this threat to American interests in various ways. How would you characterize the sense of threat that has grown in America? What do you think the big fears are that are driving our China policy?
Well, a lot of it has to do with changes that have taken place inside China and in China's external behavior. And you could take them discreetly, but added up, they make it look like, and indeed, China is, more repressive at home and more coercive abroad. And that's, expressed itself both, in terms of China's brutal treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, to the kind of crackdown in Hong Kong, and to its growing pressure campaign against Taiwan and Taiwan on the international stage. And so a lot of the kind of hardening approach, I think, in the United States to China is really a reaction to what has taken place in China. Of course, much of what has happened in China is also, in turn, a reaction to what leaders in Beijing see as kind of threats to their sovereignty and stability. And so there has been this, again, there's sort of a mutually accelerating security dilemma, if you will, that's taking place, I think, which makes it hard for both sides to see, like, what would an off-ramp look like, because any kind of restraint is interpreted, or is feared to be interpreted, as lack of resolve and something to be taken advantage of. Okay.
So a lot of that is kind of domestic Chinese policy that is influencing America's policy toward China. Those generally aren't characterized as threats to American interests, right? There is, I mean, I agree they loom large in the reaction to China, but there's also issues that, there's a sense of threat in some sense to America, right?
Sure. I mean, I think that those issues that I've talked about, whether it's Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, are all seen as, egregious abuses that the United States, as the defender of human rights around the world, needs to speak up for and
Hmm.
stand against. And so a lot of what, even though they're not seen as threats to the homeland, they are nonetheless seen as, challenges to the way the world should work, and how
Hmm.
countries ought to conduct themselves. I think there's also, particularly under the Trump administration, there was a very extreme version of the characterization of the threat that China posed, not only to, American influence overseas, but to, the very, fabric of American society, both in terms of, China's the trade with the United States, but also, the Chinese Communist Party's influence. And I
Hmm.
think those challenges on the CCP influence front have been somewhat overstated. They certainly have been corrosive to,
Hmm.
the freedom of expression in terms of, trying to intimidate, NBA, teams into, not speaking out. And so that thing is that those are definitely happening, and there are, small instances of them, trying to shape public opinion to be more, favorable to China, and to kind of discourage, politicians from speaking up against China. But I wouldn't say that these are efforts to subvert American democracy in the way that I think that some politicians and analysts see the Chinese Communist Party as an existential threat to American
Right.
democracy. What I would say there is that I think that, the existential threat to American democracy is, right here inside our borders. It's not coming from China per se, but by our own politicians.
Well, what about the fear that, China wants to encircle us increasingly with a network of authoritarian autocracies or something, or even if its vision isn't that explicitly aimed at America, that it is trying to kind of promulgate its form of governance, and that it's showing signs of success, and that's the big threat, or a big threat.
So here, this is this question of, what does a world safe for autocracy look like? How much is China trying to promote its model? I do think that China is sort of advertising its success as a way of burnishing the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy, primarily at home, but also in diffusing external pressure for what they fear is a kind of an orchestrated effort to undermine the CCP and orchestrate a color revolution.
Hmm.
But I don't see them doing what, frankly, the United States and other democracies have done for years, which is sort of tie their overseas assistance to political governance conditions. It's the conditions that they attach are, well, you first of all have to recognize China, you don't deal with Taiwan. And then there are various business conditions associated with their lending and such. But they don't have this sort of package of, well, you have to be an autocracy, or you have to, stop holding elections in order to. No, none of that. And so the, China does have strings attached. They just aren't of this kind of governance kind. And so, even though there are efforts, I think, to, train foreign leaders and such, a lot of times these end up looking like junkets that are kind of, trying to burnish networks.
Hmm.
There's a lot of not great stuff that's going on, but it isn't really about exporting a so-called China model of political governance, in my view, at least so far. But one of the concerns that I have is that if this sort of ideological competition heats up, we might well see China trying to copy Russia in, trying much more aggressively to intervene or interfere in democratic politics, believing that the only way for the CCP to be safe is by going on the offensive.
Okay, so as of now, you would say China does want to make the world safe for autocracy, in the sense that they want to be allowed to pursue their own form of governance,
Right.
and but not in the sense um, that they want autocracy to dominate the globe. They don't feel
Right.
strongly about that per se. Is that right?
Exactly. And so I don't see a zero sum competition between a world safe for autocracy and a world safe for democracy. I
Hmm.
actually think that democracy might be safer if autocracies felt a little bit less besieged.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the ways in which we may make them feel besieged? I mean, we had this whole democracy summit thing that President Biden made pretty big deal about. I've seen reporting that that actually did not escape the attention of Chinese leadership, and they weren't at all happy about it. Yeah. First of all, is that true? And what are other things that we're doing that, in your view, may not really carry a huge benefit for us, and have the cost of making it more likely that China would get into a frame of mind where they feel that their only form of defending their own form of governments is to promulgate and support other authoritarian autocracies, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So I think that this effort to, cast world politics in the framework of autocracies versus democracies is potentially counterproductive. Even if, of course, I want to defend democracy, I want democracies to stand together, but actually by painting authoritarians as the target, you make it harder to work with countries of all stripes to improve their domestic governance at home, let alone shared challenges that cross borders.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that the Summit for Democracy prompted a response in China, which first of all tried to portray itself, or at least the Chinese Communist Party tried to portray itself as the leaders of a whole process democracy, they called themselves. But it also, I think, helped galvanize the February 4th joint statement between Putin and Xi Jinping, and that the more that we play up this kind of democracies in a fight against autocracies, we may not like the kind of the results in terms of fostering continued strategic cooperation between Xi Jinping and Putin's Russia.
Mm-hmm. And then what about this kind of delicate issue of China's domestic policies, including human rights policies? Some of which I think certainly the situation with the Uyghurs, Americans naturally find abhorrent. I assume that that's one thing that China takes as you tell me, I don't know, but does it take that kind of criticism, and in some cases economic sanctions and so on, as an attempt to keep it from, as just part of the long list of ways it sees America as attacking its form of governance, right? I mean, it presumably doesn't define the things we define as grave human rights issues as grave human rights issues, right?
Right.
That's
right. And so the Chinese Communist Party really sees this through the lens of regime stability. And unfortunately, with really, disastrous consequences for the population of Xinjiang and other minorities inside China. But the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, what are the sets of policies that can really improve the situation on the ground for those in China, as well as around the globe? I mean, if it's the concern, right now is forced labor, what are the ways that we can strengthen our capacity to deal with forced labor in our supply chains, not just going after or presuming, guilt until proven innocent, which is sort of the presumption that all goods made in Xinjiang are made with forced labor, but rather, to build a capacity in our own, Customs and Border Patrol to examine, where are these, products coming from, and then throughout the supply chain to strengthen the capacity if we don't want to be, supporting these kinds of practices. Right now, I don't think we have that. And so what it looks like is an effort selectively to target China and the Xinjiang region in particular, while not doing very much to address the actual problem, and as it exists not just in China but also in the countries in Southeast Asia where much of the the trade is now going through. And so we look a little bit selective here, and that ends up kind of then being interpreted in China through the lens of geopolitics in an effort to keep China down.
Okay. Another thing that is seen by some in America as threatening, and I guess as part of this alleged strategy of building a network of autocracies or authoritarian-leaning countries that are sympathetic to China, is this Belt and Road Initiative, right? That's which I gather is has not worked out as well as China might have hoped. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what do you think is the reality of that and the perception of that in America?
Well, so first of all, I think it's important to note that whether it's the BRI or China's smart cities projects, China isn't actually, more interested in doing business with, autocracies than democracies. They
Right.
sell to whomever, and so there's a lot of, I think, of course, they are, through like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, working with other, less than democratic countries to deal with that they see as threats of instability and terrorism. But I would say that I wouldn't cast all of China's overseas efforts and initiatives as operating through some kind of network of autocracies. That's just not how it's taking shape.
Okay. And am I right that they are that the policy, they're now facing issues where it's looking like they're not going to get their debts repaid and their loans repaid, and they're kind of revising the policy in midstream?
Well, so first of all, there's, less of this overseas lending than had taken place. And they really face what some are calling a creditor trap, which is that, these countries that can't make good on those loans having trouble doesn't necessarily always put China in a great position to,
Mhm.
and so there have been, for example, in Zambia, there was a debt deal that China was forced to negotiate through the auspices of the G20 Common Framework, and so I don't think that they're interested in making that kind of a poster child for this because they don't want to have to do this across the board. But I would say that the concern about debt distress giving China this kind of coercive leverage is still more of a fear than necessarily always, been borne out in reality. And then there are some good scholarship, working on, for example, what happened in Sri Lanka. I would, recommend you to Deborah Brodegum and Meg Rithmeyer's work on that, where it's a lot more complicated than this kind of predatory lending a picture would present.
Yeah, the narrative is that loaning them the money was a trick to get China to wind up in possession of a port or something. Is
Right.
that's the simple version narrative? And I've
Right.
heard that that's not actually
Exactly.
right.
That was sort of a stylized caricature.
um, so what about China's Taiwan aside? The kind of somewhat military issues in the region. There are the border disputes. There's the fact that China has declared a pretty expansive conception of its own territorial waters, so-called Nine-Dash Line. An international tribunal ruled against China, and China just said, well, tough luck. We're defying the ruling of the international tribunal. And there's tension with various countries, Japan, Vietnam, and maybe Vietnam's an example of how China doesn't necessarily view the world as autocracy versus democracy, because Vietnam is very much an autocracy,
Right.
and yet that's one of the countries they have the most tension with, I gather, in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely.
What's we're not imagining it, right? I mean, China is throwing their weight around. What is your take on why that is and how we should think of that and respond?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of factors that are contributing here. I think there's a sense, well, from Beijing's perspective, that they had been relatively restrained, and that other countries were starting to do a lot of exploration in the South China Sea, and in some cases, they needed to get out ahead of what was going to be, sort of delimitations that were going to take place. This is in the 2009 kind of period. And so that to get out in front of that, they filed their map. And so a lot of this is actually, it's not just China moving alone in this area. But of course, China is the elephant in the room. And so when China acts, it's, much more concerning than when, Vietnam or Malaysia, works with, some foreign multinational to conduct exploration. And so I think what we're seeing now, is a Chinese effort to, one, consolidate and project power to the features that it held, but is now militarized in the South China Sea. And that has many different functions, but I think it also, among other things, it acts as kind of a deterrent, or they see it as a sort of a deterrent to, other parties in the region and to those disputes, acting in ways that are kind of, again, unilateral. So but this is again consistent with China's effort to use coercive power to get to push back against what it perceives as challenges to its claims. And what we've seen in recent years is that not just sort of pushing back, but pushing back really hard, so that in the end, China ends up with a stronger position as a result of its reaction to these smaller challenges. And so that's been, kind of conducted across the board, whether that's in the East China Sea, over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, as this, the 2012 crisis that was precipitated when the Japanese government nationalized the islands or purchased the islands from a private owner. China not only reacted, but started to conduct unprecedented patrols to effectively contest Japan's administration. You see the same along the Indian border. Of course, the details are slightly different, but it's sort of a reaction that's quite sizable in ways that fortify China's position and advances their claim. Not expanding their claim necessarily, but advancing and strengthening it.
And so various things are happening in reaction to this. Japan is beefing up its own military. The U.S. is, I gather, making our presence maybe more substantial, and I don't know, maybe slightly more assertive. I mean, this whole pivot to Asia concept that goes back years now, and may have been complicated by the Ukraine war, among other things. But still, the idea is we should beef up our military presence and so on. What other things are being done in response to this? And of all the things being done in response by the U.S., by regional friends of ours, what do you think are the wise ones, and what do you think are the not so wise ones?
So I would say that a lot of the response has been in the kind of military and security domain. A lot of these countries are working more closely with us than they have in the past, or have expressed interest in doing so. But there's I think a missing component here, which is the economic links that, many of these countries, their largest trading partner remains China. And many of them are looking to the United States to, help provide an economic alternative. And really, so far, given the politics of trade in the United States, that's been, I think, up to some extent, hamstrung the kind of economic initiatives that the United States has been able to offer the region. The current incarnation is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which will help to some extent, depending on how it materializes, but is not the same as the Trans-Pacific Partnership or some other initiative that really has market access as part of it. And so, given the state of affairs, I think many see, I think, as Evan Feigenbaum said, the United States is like the Hessians of the region. Sort of the military muscle, but not really there shaping the kind of underlying economic reality, which still really revolves around China.
So, on the Chinese side, in terms of the change in tenor of its kind of stance toward the world, it, again, I don't think we're imagining things to think that it's gotten more assertive. There's the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, if I've got that term right, which is, I guess means stuff like, talking trash on Twitter and things like that, right? But again, they've been regionally assertive and just kind of a little less shy and humble on the stage. And one question is, why is that? There is, on the one hand, Xi Jinping is a new leader. On the other hand, I think some of this predates his tenure by a little. There's a question of to what extent this is reactive to perceived provocations or signs of disrespect from abroad. How would you characterize why relations have gotten, and of course COVID was a threshold, right? The way that played out, the fact that it arose in China, suspicions that it may have been a lab leak and that they weren't transparent about that, and the fact that this happened in the context of the Trump administration, within which there were people who really wanted to maximally exploit this. So there's all that recently. But if we go back further and trace the kind of decline of relations back even earlier than 2010. How would you characterize like what has happened and why?
Hmm. So a lot of parts to your question. I think that, relations were, deteriorating, or I should say they were more and more characterized by this kind of hedging or security dynamic. Really, of course, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was no longer a shared security threat that both were confronting. There was a bit of a reprieve during, after 9/11, when the United States was focused on the war on terror and China was sort of a back burner issue. I think as that started to fade, or the United States became, more alarmed by especially China's island building in the South China Sea, there was, I think, whether you want to date it to the late Obama administration, a growing concern about the direction that China was headed in. Things got a lot worse, I would say, under the Trump administration, where the Trump administration first, unleashed the trade war, really trying to use this kind of muscle to kind of force China to kind of reset the terms of our economic engagement. And that, did bear fruit sort of in the phase one deal, which sort of kind of temporarily, created a plateau. But as you said, I think COVID really sort of unleashed a new dynamic where, suddenly in a year where the Trump administration was campaigning for re-election, there was this, catastrophic pandemic, which had originated in China, even though, there's still little, I think, good evidence that this was anything but a naturally arising pathogen. So but that finger pointing, which had to some extent on the Chinese side, predated the pandemic. This wolf warrior diplomacy was, I think, really, touched off by Xi Jinping's, exhortation to Chinese diplomats to, dare to struggle and be good at fighting, believing that, the United States would only respect strength and would, exploit signs of weakness. Now, I think it's quite unfortunate. I think that this kind of, boastful and kind of vituperative Twitter diplomacy is really a bad look for China. It's a bad look for any government that wants to engage in mocking others. It certainly is not cultivating a lovable image, as Xi Jinping has more recently said that China should cultivate. But it's a desire to be, to take others down a peg, I think, and and make China look good by comparison. But it's really this going on the negative that has not played well, certainly amongst developed democracies. Public opinion polls suggest that China's reputation is sort of at an all-time low. But I don't know, amongst the developing world, it's less clear that this has been so so repugnant. So China today is doing a lot better, I think, in much of the developing world, playing to some of their kind of longstanding resentments about the United States and other privileged nations kind of taking advantage of others and really wielding their power and privileges at the expense of others.
So the militant tone may be working with one audience and not with another.
That's right.
That's interesting. To what extent do you think some of this, including the regional military assertiveness, was maybe not an inevitable, but a likely and in some ways natural consequence of China's just growing power, right? I mean, it's an emerging power, and emerging powers historically have thrown their weight around. The U.S. did. So, how much of it is kind of that? Like, don't expect it to change. It was coming all along.
There's definitely an element of that. I think the question, though, remains is how could China use its power in ways to maximize its efficacy while minimizing resistance? And the way that China has been throwing around its weight really to deter opposition has also created, I think, real fear and suspicion that, similarly, to show any sign of weakness is just to invite more bullying, and that what one needs to do around the region or the United States is to stand up to China. And that's not the reaction that I think a rising power is, would want to see. And so to the extent that there are voices inside China that say, this isn't a great strategy, It's because of this. It's because of the fear that China's actions have created around the region.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like one thing the two countries' foreign policies have in common is right now, I think, is the idea that, strength and forceful deterrence is what matters, and diplomacy can be taken as a sign of weakness.
Unfortunately, I think there is that mirroring dynamic, but both sides then are missing the fact that deterrence requires an equal dose of reassurance, that you give the other countries a real choice, which is that if they don't act in whatever way, that they won't be exploited. And that, I think, that component of reassurance has really been missing.
Okay. I guess maybe a final question. I was, I'm sure you're aware of this book. What is it? Danger Zone. Is that the name of it? By Hal Brands and Michael Beckley. I had them on my show, discuss the book with them. They're of course, China hawks, as I got them to agree during the course of the conversation. They emphasized the 2008 financial collapse, which was, originated in the West, in America, in the subprime mortgage market, and the securities, the securities market, as being a threshold. And as I guess, as they see it, China kind of woke up and really realized that, the West is really not omnipotent, and they really screw up. And, maybe we can, maybe this is our moment to rise, or something like that. Was 2008 a big deal, you think, in Chinese psychology?
I think it was a big deal, not just because the global financial crisis really took the luster off of the Western model of development and market economics. It was also a big year because it was the year of the Beijing Olympics, and riots in Tibet, which really shone a spotlight on China's human rights abuses and created a lot of antibodies. And the sense in China that its rise wasn't as welcome as they might have thought. And so this combination of having less sense of there's something that China could learn from the West, as well as a sense of disrespect, and the need to show pride and to demonstrate China's strength, even in the face of adversity, I think were important components of what took place in 2008.
Okay. Now, I assume you've if not read their book, you're familiar with the argument in Danger Zone. Any 1 minute book review you want to deliver?
So I haven't read the book, but I've read the versions of the argument in various articles. I think the most important thing is that I don't see, demographic, decline in China as necessarily leading to China lashing out in the way that they, I think, predict. And there's just really no evidence, from past Chinese foreign policy behavior that domestic discontent or challenges has led to more aggressive foreign policy behavior. One, and then two, there's a little evidence that Chinese decision makers think that their best days are behind them. The rhetoric all points in the other direction, which is that time and momentum are in China's side. The East is rising. So I just, although I think they're very smart folks, and I have respect for them individually, I don't think that this argument is one that really ought to be persuasive.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument because traditionally the China hawk argument had been China is, rising, big, growing, more and more menacing. Their argument is, it faces a ton of problems, demographic, economic, and so on. So it's going to get insecure and lash out, and that's why we need, military buildup and so on. So it's an unusual argument.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you want to add before you? I know you got to go right about now, but is there anything you want to?
No, thanks. Thanks for such a great and substantive conversation. It was a pleasure to be with you.
All right. Well, appreciate your work. Where are you on Twitter? You want to give people a Twitter handle or anything?
Sure. It's Jessica C. Weiss.
One word?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right.